My name is Finian O'Shea, and it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's session to you. We have two speakers lined up for this afternoon. The first speaker is Dr. Dave Eddyburn, who's coming to us from the University of Central Florida in the US, where he is Professor and Associate Dean of Research at the College of Education and Human Performance of the university. His research and teaching interests focus on the use of technology to enhance teaching, learning, and performance. He has authored over 175 articles and book chapters on the use of technology in special education. His work represents a variety of contributions to policy, theory, research, and practice. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce him to the conference this afternoon. Dave.
Good afternoon and welcome, and I'm honored to be here. And after lunch, my job is to keep you awake. So, as they mentioned this morning, the program this afternoon changes to focus on assistive technology, and I've been asked to try and be provocative, to talk about some of the trends and issues and what's ahead, perhaps, in the field of assistive technology. So I ask your indulgence as we do a quick tour of some of the issues that are facing us in the U.S. that I also believe are relevant at a global level. Let me begin by providing a dissection, if you will, of the term assistive technology as it was codified in the United States. Often in the States, we would read this together in unison because this is one of the things that we all seem to know about assistive technology, and that's the definition. It begins, an assistive technology device means any item, piece of equipment, or product system. What's interesting, when we put all those words together, they're synonyms. So basically, we continue, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified, or customized. So that's different ways you can get it. You can go to the store and buy it. You can buy it, bring it home and change it, or you can build it in your garage. That's used to increase, maintain, and improve. Again, we've got a set of synonyms. The functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So what's real fun after we do this definition is that it comes down to AT is anything. AT is anything. Hence the problem for our practitioners trying to justify whether we should purchase assistive technology or not, because AT is anything that enhances the functional capability of a person with a disability. So what happens is, if I come into this room and the door opens automatically because it has a sensor and detects my body and the door opens, that is not assistive technology. However, if I come into the same room using a crutch or a wheelchair, it's assistive technology. Isn't that awesome? It's the same sensor on the door, but for one person it's AT and the others it's not. So a few years ago I wrote an article saying this definition is 25 years old, maybe we should re-examine it because it's not working out so well. Well, what I found out in the States is that it got copied into 50 states and 5 federal laws, and it's like being chiseled in granite. We really can't change it. And so one of the things I want to share with you is the problematic nature of the definition and one of the things it holds for the future. Here in Ireland, my understanding is you've adopted the definition from the International Standards Organization, which begins any product. Now, we elaborate a little bit talking about devices, equipment, instruments, software that's especially produced or generally available. So again, we went shopping or we modified it. Used by or for persons with disabilities for participation. And here's a very good addition to the definition. To protect, support, train, measure, or substitute for body functions, structures, and activities. Or to prevent impairments, activity limitations, or participation restrictions. So the advantage of this definition, it focuses on what the intervention is for and what I'm being, the barriers to my participation. And I want to focus on this quite a bit in the sense of what we talk about today, because really in both of these definitions there's 3 parts. And we talk about the devices, that's the stuff we could get. But in both definitions, the one I didn't show you from the States about AT services, it relates to the support, the training, the resources you need to make it work, because we recognize that just buying stuff may not change your performance. But neither definition or any of the other global definitions used talk about AT outcomes. And so the problem here is we have a 3-legged stool with only 2 legs, because neither definition requires us to show that there's benefit. So the idea here is that we go shopping and we hope it helps, and then we move on to our next client. There is no requirement that we stay and work with you to maximize your use of that tool or to exploit the tool so that your performance is indistinguishable between that of your peers. And that really should be the goal. And so let me introduce to you the problem we're going to try to solve today as we think about assistive technology. And the issue is assistive technology in schools, largely in addition to access, is focused on achievement in the curriculum. And so we've got a historical model here of the achievement gap, and the difference between expected achievement, which is on the diagonal, is that as you spend another year in school, you should be gaining another year of curriculum knowledge and performance and competency. And if you're so benefiting, your performance is going to be on the diagonal. Each year you're in school, there's another unit of growth. However, for students with disabilities, as well as other students who might be language minority, students who come from different ethnic backgrounds, and students living in poverty, their performance tends to look like the lower line. And what happens is there's small differences when they enter school, and they become larger differences over time. And unfortunately, those of us in special education cannot point to a body of research that shows that after 12 years of being in special ed, we've closed the gap. And so there's not much evidence to show that special education as an intervention closes the achievement gap, which then raises the question, what have we been doing? So I'd like to talk to us today about thinking about how low achievement should be a trigger to consider assistive technology. So I would argue that any child's performance who's not on the diagonal, that's not performing at grade level, therefore should be considered a candidate for assistive technology, whatever that is that we'll talk about. Okay? Not sure if that's controversial here or not. People tried to warn me that, okay, we'll go on. My flight leaves shortly. There's another issue as we talked about inclusion today and trying to enhance student performance. What you see on the left is a graph of the traditional bell curve that many of us were trained in a model of learner variance that we understood that most human traits were sorted on a bell curve. And so we see in the lower left corner low performance and versus high performance. Many of us recognize this in the context of IQ testing, and that we've got some challenges. Unfortunately, many of us in the teaching profession think our job now is to sort children based on this curve, that I can only have so many A's, so many high ability students, and the rest of us have to be sorted. And in the bulk here, the average performance is that C range. We have high standards. Not all of you can be A students, and we're using the grading system to justify what we do to children and sorting them into this model, which in the 20th century really sorted us for life. It affected our work opportunities and our lifetime earning incomes. And yet something's happened as we've been talking about educational reform, and that's the graphic on the right, which is called a J curve. That basically when you come into my classroom on Monday and you can't do it, that my job the next 5 days is to teach you whatever this unit is. But on Friday, you are all going to be high achievers. So you begin the week at very low achievement, but through the activities I have and the support I provide, I am going to get you to high achievement by Friday. And unfortunately, our global focus on international standards, this is how our curriculum is being based, is that you have 5 days to achieve whatever objective. And if you don't meet it, if you fail the objective, next Monday we go on. Well, if you told me we all have to master this objective, but next week we go on, when do I get it? And so in the States, this has led to things like double dose of algebra. Isn't this awesome? You just failed algebra, so now you get to have it twice a day. Do we really expect achievement to go up when you failed it once and we're going to use the same instructional methods twice? So we're going to talk about something today I want to call inherent bias in our work, and that is, how much failure data do I need before I know you can't do it? And more importantly, should I do anything about it? So what happens here with the J curve is if you can predict on Monday that I'm going to fail your lesson by Friday, shouldn't Monday through Friday be different? Because if I didn't learn my 50 or my 100 multiplication facts, is it really reasonable to think I'm going to learn my 50 states and capitals in 5 days? Or is this an example of educational malpractice? That I spend 5 days abusing you with an instructional system that I know doesn't work, because my job really is to sort you on the bell curve. I want to make sure you do that, that you stay in your 5th percentile, because I don't believe you can learn. And in that case, I would suggest we might as well tattoo my percentile on my forehead, because you are very convinced and the system operates to keep me at the 5th percentile. And so now we've crossed over into a language of social justice and talking about what are the tools that we're providing or withholding. And the issue I'm going to suggest to you is that I think we should look at the bottom 50% as candidates for something I'm going to call a performance support, which I'll mention in a second. But the reality here is that we're being confronted that education and the work we do is now considered by government officials and the business community as an economic resource. That back in the 1800s, economic resources were minerals and people. But now in the 21st century, it's not only people, but it's intellectual, it's knowledge, and it's the application of intellectual competitiveness. And so, unfortunately, folks, we are now in an environment where we cannot afford disposable workers. That back in the early 20th century, we could find jobs for the people in the bottom 50 percentile. But all of the futurists are telling us the jobs of the future are going to demand more education, more tools, more cognitive decision making. And so the question becomes, if we are going to use education as an economic tool, how do we resource it so that we make sure that we don't lose any workers? And again, we often don't think about that as educators, but that is an undercurrent of our theme. So let's move on and talk about who needs AT. Some of you are familiar with the excellent research report that was produced here by NCSE 2 years ago. That's actually one of the better global papers talking about the research base. And one of the things they did here in Ireland was to do a very comprehensive search of who was using AT, and they tried to make some estimates of who was underserved. Now, we have a similar problem in the state, but we've not funded any large-scale research. So we have a AT policy analyst, Diane Golden, who made some expert observations. And her concern was, as she talked with school principals, is she wanted them to discover students that could benefit from the tools we're going to talk about, but were not on their radar. And so one of the things she would say is, if you have a student who's blind or visually impaired, 100% of those students need assistive technology, not just in school, but for navigating life. And so she used this sort of as a benchmarking tool to tell principals, look at your population and see if the number of student users are anywhere close to this. And most of the small-scale surveys we've conducted in the United States indicates we're far below these expectancies. Now, the other thing is this has not been empirically tested, which I think your country is closer to maybe if we looked at these data, but the conclusion in Ireland is that you are not servicing all. And so our challenge here is that besides the students with complex and severe needs who have a need for assistive technology 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, that those students are not receiving what they need. And then some of our other students, like students with learning disabilities, it tends to be hidden, and we're just saying things like try harder, or here, I'll use a new strategy and then you'll get it. And so the question becomes is how long do we let you fail before we do to make another intervention? So the question here is pretty much anything we've done over the last 30 years has not succeeded in closing the achievement gap. And I'd prefer not to present assistive technology as your last-ditch measure, but I would like to give you permission to say we need to do this. Because if you continue the status quo, what you're doing is you're experimenting on my child, and that my child will be on the lower bar, as we've done for the last 70 years. So I think one of the call-outs for our elected officials and our advisors and ministries and boards is to start thinking about, okay, what are the technology tools that we can give students that alter this journey, this path? Because it looks like chronic underachievement, we don't close that gap. Okay, so as I mentioned, I would suggest to us that we start thinking about, and I give you a license in every classroom, inclusive classrooms. We're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between assistive technology and universal design for learning. One of the things that we've discovered is to get the children that need something special, we may have to flip the paradigm to give it to all. So rather than coming in and giving one child a specific device, we may be looking at ways to give those kinds of tools to all the children, because again, there's a bottom 50% that can't do the same task. So why should we go through this individual evaluation process to help just one child when those same tools could be distributed more broadly? This is a profound issue for the field and the future of assistive technology, in the sense of, will we continue like we've been doing, which then we have no evidence that we've reached everybody, or do we modify our service delivery to think about the best attributes of universal design for learning and assistive technology that would allow us to deploy tools in inclusive classrooms that are there, embedded supports before the students need them? So I think one of the challenges in your country and mine is redefining assistive technology as something called performance support. That is, there's a task you can't do, which is multiplication, it's comparing rocks and minerals, whatever these cognitive tasks that we're trying to do in our classroom. The question becomes then, what tools would support learning? Remember, we only have 5 days at best. And so if you can predict ahead of time that because of my history, I am not a good candidate for success in your classroom, the question becomes, how does that classroom become different for those 5 days so that we can ensure achievement? Now, I'll bring another exclamation point to that in a minute. Section 3 of the 5 sections I want to present to you is there's another dilemma happening around us, which is when assistive technology goes mainstream. Most of us actively resist being called out to be special. I don't know if any of you are dealing with aging parents, but one of the things is they look at a walker or a wheelchair as a signal that, oh, I'm not that bad. I don't need that. And they won't use it, they run from it, and eventually, when they eventually need it, they're still fighting with us. But this notion of self-concept and my inability that's telegraphed to everybody in the room, gee, he can't do that, it is an issue for us. Now again, one of the issues we're finding with Universal Design for Learning is what we learned about providing screen enlargement. Historically, this has been an issue for simply people who have low vision. Is we take curriculum, we stick it under this closed circuit TV camera, and it blows up the text big enough that I can see it, maybe only a few words at a time. But again, this is considered an assistive technology. We would not put one of these in every classroom because we didn't think every classroom needed one. However, when we built these same tools into the operating system, you may not know, but every web browser now lets you do this. So when you go to grandma's house and you're seeing nose prints on the computer screen, because she's trying to get close enough to read the Dublin paper, one of the signals you might do is Command or Control plus, which will then enlarge the whole screen. Okay, and you can do it multiple times to get it big enough, just like the closed circuit camera. So the issue here is I share that with you as an advocacy skill. I don't know if grandma really needs that, but the point is now that you know that any text in any browser window can be enlarged, you have a tool that can be deployed as needed. So the great thing is grandma thinks she doesn't need it, but after you leave and she starts using it, you can check up on her because you'll see the default now is very large. But if in a school I came to sat down to the computer the next hour after you, I can reverse that by using Command or Control minus to bring it back or reset it to normal, typical. Okay? So here's an example of what's happening by studying people on the margins, sometimes these marginalized populations, that we can make things better for everybody. And again, what this means is now I can provide for middle school students who don't want to be different. I can show the whole class how to do this, and we can find out. However, there's a flip side, is that sometimes when we think just because we provide universal design, there's no need for assistive technology. And yet, in some schools, you will still need these screen enlargement systems. Okay? So that is part of our work, is to find out what works for whom and under what conditions. And if you can't answer that for me, then your job tonight is to go home and figure it out and come back with something else tomorrow. John Hattie refers to this as teachers being R&D. You research today and find out what worked for part of your class. Your homework tonight is to come up with a new intervention, come back tomorrow and try it. Because again, you have 5 days to get everybody to that performance level. Okay? Next one is something called text-to-speech. Again, it's kind of inconceivable that we would have products that don't talk. Any of you that have used your mapping program or GPS in the car, you're used to being told, turn right. Recalculating. Evidently you didn't turn right, so it's recalculating. Anyway, but yet in school we think that this is cheating. The reading community has convinced us, when will you learn to read? If I let you listen to things, that's not reading. I was engaged in the States with a high-level group creating national tests, and this became a really problematic area because the research is very mixed. And so again, they would create artificial rules that text-to-speech was allowable on some subtests and not others. Okay? But the issue here is that if things don't talk, I can simply copy and paste to make it talk. It's really a non-issue. And so the question for students after grade 3, I think all curricula should talk. You're focused on the content, and if you're going to keep tripping me because I don't have grade level reading skills, that means you're tattooing my 5th percentile on my forehead. You like marginalizing me and keeping me in my place. Okay? This is not a question of technology anymore, it's a question of knowledge and training. But it's also a question of bias. Okay, what is our bias about how learning happens? So here's the challenge for us is if we start by, as we think about inclusion, that I don't have to know the students coming in next hour. That if I work in schools today, my classroom is going to be very academically diverse. I will have students at grade level, I'll have some above, I'll have some below. So the question is, what's different in here? And this has been a point of confusion about universal design for learning, thinking teachers will do it, as opposed to putting it on designers to say, how do I make tiered text? How do I make multilingual talking text so that whatever student needs it, we can just turn it on? Okay, so let me show you a couple examples, and I'm going to jump out of my PowerPoint for a second to show you some live examples if we can make this work. The first one I want to introduce to you is something called Newsela, and this was created in the States to help students gain access to current events. So what happens here, we're celebrating Thanksgiving. I'm not sure why we're using the former president, but old photo. What happens here is the teacher selects the article that we're going to study, but then up here at the top, the student plays Goldilocks. And what happens is you usually have 5 or more levels, and what they're using is something called lexile levels, which is a measure of text complexity. So if you'd like this level, one of the things is we tell students what their lexile level is. So to simply change the complexity and the difficulty of that, we simply go use a slider to make it more complex. And one of the things that research found is that many college-bound students are not interacting with enough complex text. So the max function pushes it up to college level. How can I challenge my gifted students? So the idea of getting this for those of you that need it, if I come dancing into your class and only give it to you, that would be assistive technology. But if I want to get to those of you that have reading delays, reading impairments, or non-readers, I would deploy this to the whole class, and then I would teach you how to use the slider to get it just right, which I consider a challenge for 21st century learning to be called Goldilocks. Sample them all, figure out what's just right. Now, teachers don't, not the breaking and entering part, sorry about that, and breaking in the bear's house. And, we don't want that part. But the issue here is that some teachers don't believe that students will make the right choices. But here's the reality. You can't look at me and tell me how much I'm struggling here. Okay, I may not give a rip about Thanksgiving, or I may have a different cultural background that I don't understand this. So the issue of a student to make on-the-fly choices about what's the most appropriate. The educational research is very clear. Learning occurs when challenge is optimal. If it's too hard, I give up. I don't want to do this. If it's too easy, I'm bored. So here's a design principle that, folks, if you would give me any curricula, I could make tiers for you. Okay? Now, if we don't tier it, then you are left making an accommodation. Okay? Something I didn't plan to show you, but you inspire me by your lack of participation. No. Here is some text. I'll see if I can copy real quick. Here is some text. We can go grab some information out of Wikipedia. Most students would find this as difficult or as boring as your textbook, so it's a good example. But the hence the challenge of doing live presentations. We're going to a website called Text Compactor, and you can kind of think of it like trash compactor. And what it does is it allows me to paste in a piece of text, use a slider to get it simplified. So 1, 2, 3 steps, and we'll see if this comes up. So what will happen is I've taken some text that I couldn't read or don't want to read, I'll paste it in Text Compactor, and then it'll give me a summary. And so that's the kind of accommodation that teachers may have to make, but I'd also say get out of the way. Teach that directly to your students. When they go to university, they will be overwhelmed first year with texts. And so can they get a summary that's just right? And well, maybe we'll go there during the Q&A. All right, let me go back on. So anyway, that's called Newsela. And the idea is it's a design principle to think in advance of what support should be embedded for all. Okay? So again, a kind of a profound way of thinking that assistive technology may change. Second example I want to show you is something, is a professor at MIT, and he's very concerned about the future of learning in the sense that he thinks we're being constrained by paper. And that when I look at paper, it's not interactive, I can't do anything. So he's writing interactive text. So watch what happens. When you eat 4 cookies, you consume 2,000 calories today at lunch. But watch what happens. If I drag that to say I'm going to eat less cookies, notice it dynamically changed the data. 2 cookies eat 100 calories. Now again, those of you with good math skills, you're like, okay, this is simple math. But for students to play with this and interact between text and graphics and information, this is something that leads to understanding. And one of the things he argues is in journal articles, we don't understand those graphs, so let's play with them. And by using this programming language, he's talking about how do I engage people in learning the relationship of what's going on. Something that we have a hard time teaching in the STEM areas about how to get understanding of key concepts. Text compactor is still working. Let me go back to the PowerPoint and we'll jump back out later. The takeaway from this section here is, as showed you Newsela and text compactor, is that anything you try to teach me, your class will be at 5 stages of learning, okay? And the novice in your classroom has no idea what you're talking about, doesn't know the words, doesn't know where to begin, doesn't know how to end. And often we think this is a success story when we can move these children to an advanced beginner where they have some understanding. And yet, if we stay with this, we become competent at some point. If we continue on it with upper level study, we might become proficient. And as we know, 10,000 hours or 10 years of devoted study makes you an expert. And so the issue we have in K-12 education is we are trying to force students to become from novices to competent, whether they want to or not. Whereas adults, you can decide how much beekeeping you want to know and quit this process at any time. So this to me suggests, folks, that I need a curriculum that has 5 pathways or 5 tiers to accommodate the academic diversity coming into my classroom, okay? And I can't do that on paper, but I think I can do that with technology. Let me make a slight detour before I challenge us with some other ideas about what the future of assistive technology might look like. The question has come up about how we measure the benefits of assistive technology. And so I want to share with you a simple practical strategy. You can decide if it's very practical or not, but we call it the TSCD model. And what that stands for is time and a series of things we're going to measure. And we know you're going to be doing concurrent things, that just giving you a technology may or may not help you because we're also doing instruction. So if you give me AT and you're teaching me, how do I know which one really helped? Okay, so we're going to try to tease that out. And then we're going to look for proof that helps the funders understand whether this is really a benefit to you or not. And unfortunately in our field, because we are often dealing with children with very complex needs, we don't know what the answer is. Often we don't use data to make the decision. We just say, well, you couldn't do it before and you look happy now. This is good. And we were talking, this is a problem for our field. We don't have the evidence base because we've built anecdotal stories that this appears to work and you like it. And so what's happened is satisfaction has become a proxy for outcome. So here's what we suggest you do. We suggest you have to measure unaided performance. So we're going to take away your AT and we're going to give you a task. So for this example, let's just talk about math. If I give you 10 math problems, okay, and I'm going to do that for 5 days, how you doing? Because I'm a great teacher, right? How you doing? Here's what happens when we have high standards. And I look at the top quartile of my class. Because I don't know, do you play Mirror, Mirror on the Wall? Somebody actually mentioned this at dinner last night, but they had a different answer. Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, who's the best teacher of them all? When we play this game in Wisconsin, we look at the top quartile. And because they're very effective and probably knew it before they came to class, who's the best teacher of them all? So the problem here is the blame game, that when you can't do it, it's your fault, right? Get them out of my classroom, send them to somebody else that helped. So what happens here is that we justify this poor performance. And after 5 days, we say, well, I still have the rest of the quarter. Well, what happens if I say this is 5 weeks? And any guess what my quarterly grade is going to be after 5 weeks of? Can we agree that, a high of 30% is a failure? So here's the problem. Even if your grade book drew pictures, where's the question that says do something? To say this child needs an intervention. See, here's what's happening is we tolerate failure by saying it's somebody else's job. If only the parent worked with the child and the family did more, or if last year's teacher did more, or special education teacher came and worked with me more, okay? So here's what we do, is you can make a graph like this. What you need is simply a spreadsheet. We're gonna graph in one row without, and each day you're gonna give me a 10 item. It could be 5 items, but we like 10 because that scales to percentages. So you're simply gonna record my score over 5 days, and then it draws this picture. But the other thing is we're gonna add another row, and we're gonna call that with technology. So watch what happens when I come to your school and I give the child the appropriate assistive technology. So again, we're talking about math problems. Now, what happens in day 1 is there's a tremendous increase, a 50% increase in performance because I gave that child something magical. But what happens on day 2 is I take away the magical tool, and what happens in the blue is, whoa, they went up to 30%. Maybe something good has happened. But what happened on day 3, it goes back down to 20. So what the blue is showing us is that there was no learning. The child is not getting better by himself with the task. Folks, this is data to support the diagnosis there's a disability. Because after 5 days, I can still not do it myself, even though you've had good instruction. But what the red is showing us is what happens by the end of the week when the child's interacting with the tool on a regular basis, is that he's got acceptable performance, probably beating part of the class. Which leads to a new problem. How do you interpret this data? Which grade do you give me on Friday? Did I earn my F, which is what you put in your grade book? Or would you give me an A? Because with my assistive technology, I am able to engage and perform like my peers. Okay? Here's a problem in a form of a bias that we've not resolved as a field, and I suspect you will find in your local schools. The issue of, can we make something too easy? Can I support you so you do it too well? Now remember earlier I talked about tattooing my percentile on my forehead. What happens from a 90 to 100 percentile people, their students and their parents are going to push back because they want extra credit for using their raw brain cells, right? That's cheating down there because we don't want those children mixed up with us at the top of the pile. There's benefits from being at this part of the pile, okay? And we don't want that confusion. So what will often happen in this situation is you will get pushback from providing the appropriate technologies because some of us want extra credit. Okay? Now, as we end the presentation, we're going to talk more about cognitive technologies, and if this has not been an issue in your community, it's going to be, because the future of knowledge workers is using more technology tools that augment what happens here. In the United States, what we found is that to be college and career ready meant using technology in the workplace. But we had to take it away from you at the test because we have high standards, which we might as well tattoo on your forehead because we really want your place in line to seal your life journey. Well, what happens here is another graph of data that you might see if you were doing this at home, is that you find minimal benefit provided by the technology. What this appears to be is that the technology provided a scaffold that can be discarded because notice the blue has been going up. So I didn't think I could do quadratic equations, but once you gave me a tool that helped me draw and graph them, I was learning this. So again, we have a different outcome. In this case, we would probably say it was a learning aid. And the point is, just like the door sensor, we won't know until we give it to all of you. But this is one of my fears about personalized learning, is that we're going to get data about each child that's going to inform our understanding of whether this is assistive technology that you need all the time or that you just need in the process of learning. But what happens with the previous graph is the example of, could you do it outside in the hallway? Could you do it down the street in the parking lot? The blue data tells us what? No. But the red data tells us at least we have one situation that you can do it. And folks, this is, I think, the first step of closing the achievement gap, because what we've got for 70 years is we can't find anything that works. Your performance is always blue. And so one of the licenses I would like to challenge you to think about is, as we look at the world of technology tools, how do we bring them in and experiment with them with children, as John Hattie talks about, to find out what works for whom and under what conditions. Again, I can help you with the spreadsheet if you're so inclined, if you're actually going to try to do this, but I think this is one of the things that we've not done because the federal laws have not required outcome data. And I think these simple graphs help some of our policymakers understand what the issue is. Let me, before we head into the future, let me forecast some things that are happening. You may have lived through this disruption, but we keep hearing a lot about how schools are going to be disrupted, the world's going to be disrupted. Here's an example of not too many years ago of an augmentative communication device. So if somebody that doesn't have a voice, we would buy and acquire this $8,000 device. And what happened, it was very difficult to implement, very difficult to train. The child was at the mercy of someone else to create the vocabulary. A father in New York worked with designer friends to create the Tango, and this was before the iPhone came out. And so he brought the price down to about $1,500 with this really cool device that all the children in the classroom wanted to use, and that his son was not embarrassed in middle school to have a communication device. But where the field has been upended is with a product called Prolo Quo To Go, which is now an iPhone-based communication app that children and families can use themselves. And that this $200 device has completely disrupted the industry where it used to cost $8,000. Okay? So there are a lot of people in our sector now trying to say that all of the apps, all the special needs will be delivered in an app-based environment like this. And so again, if you don't have school staff or ministry engaged in app searching and vetting of some sort, this appears to be the future of assistive technology, delivering specialized tools across mainstream devices. Well, to conclude, let me try to challenge you about what the future could look like. And I will start by saying my crystal ball is no better than anybody, but I'm far from home, so let me share. One of the things that I'm seeing, and that perhaps you have as well, is something called convergence, is that we're seeing more products in our classrooms being based in the cloud, and there's a number of reasons for that, one of which is big data. Right now, as a publisher, if I put something out there, I don't know if students use it, and more importantly, I don't know if they learn. So we call that an open loop. Big data and cloud-based kinds of applications, I'll show you in a second, allow me to get data to say, should I add more features? Should I drop that one because nobody's using it? It also allows us to use predictive analytics to say, okay, are you more like these students that have taken this before that have been successful, in which case I can take you through the curriculum quicker, or are you going to need remediation, and what kinds of interventions might you need for that? Which ultimately, I think where we're going to head is something called more personalized learning. This is an equivalent to something called precision medicine, that we don't treat all cancers the same. I make a cocktail just for your special needs, and the question is, why aren't we doing that for children? Here in Northern Ireland, you have a company called TextHelp that's created a product called Read and Write. This used to be special software. They worked with Google. This is now a Chrome extension. And so it works anytime the children are in Google Docs, that all the supports for highlighting, text-to-speech, second language translation, text summarization are built into this product, and we give it to all of you. So here's a real-life example of the evolution of assistive technology to universal design for learning. We did that one already. Let me jump out and go to Wolfram. Well, tell you what, let's go back to this, given the time. Wolfram Alpha is a website company that is creating something that I want you to know about, and it's called computational knowledge. They're arguing they're going to be the future Google, because you will simply put in your query once, and the answer will come out. So you get a very nice interface like this. You type in natural language. I want to know, compare Stockholm to Chicago. And what happens is it begins telling and finding out those are both cities and countries. It gives me some basic population figures. It draws a map, gives me airport travel time, gives me temperature comparisons, and it gives me some data about the two cities with one query. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but I think about students that have language and reading problems, and I think this would solve a lot of challenges if they could go to one place. This is the back end of something called self-driving cars. This is the back end of something happening called virtual assistants, where now we won't use a keyboard, but we'll speak to our devices, and they will assist us. When we now marry this with a robot, I have a personal assistant. I just read an article yesterday morning from the UK. One of the educational leaders was predicting a majority of teachers would be replaced in 10 years by artificial intelligence tutors. Now, those of us involved in transition and preparing students for the future, I want to ask you to think about the future of work, because the future is not necessarily like the past. So here's a very interesting website where you can go by sector to say, here, my job's at risk. And what happens when you pull up this, the interactive graphic shows the kinds of jobs that will be eliminated, and one of which is on target is teacher tutors. Now, we still may need to be in the classroom for behavioral management and other kinds of things, but in the future of education, these machines may be smarter than us. And so they're suggesting that we need to rethink the future of providing personal assistance when we could have virtual assistants that perform. To conclude, my time is up, so I'm going to stop here. To proceed and be bold is the signpost I want to give you, but as Maya Angelou says, do the best you can do until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So thank you.